Well, good morning and welcome back to Nazareth. And as we continue to walk the journey of the hidden years of Nazareth, we also continue to unpack that very significant experience in Jesus' life when he was 12 years old and he was lost in the temple. As we've been looking at different aspects of the story of the first pilgrimage to the temple shifts today as we continue reading from the Gospel of Luke. And I quote from chapter 2 as we read, "Thinking that he was in the caravan, they journeyed for a day and looked for him among their relatives and acquaintances. But not finding him, they returned to Jerusalem to look for him." I want you to imagine losing your child. And I can just imagine that for many parents who are even listening to this, that's a horrific thought. But just for the sake of appreciating the experience of Joseph and Mary, just imagine losing your child. The scriptures say very clearly that Jesus is lost in their eyes. He's gone. Now I want you to imagine who he is. That God has entrusted you with the greatest gift of all time, the Messiah himself, and he's missing, lost, gone. Imagine the emotions, the fear, the worry, the anxiety. After walking north for a full day and retracing their steps back to Jerusalem, Mary and Joseph, the scripture says, found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you done this? Your father and I have been looking for you with great anxiety." The very first Passover pilgrimage to Jerusalem, Jesus is lost for 3 days. However, when he's found, we see the beauty of Jesus' adherence to the Father's will. It's because of the Father's will, it's because of his relationship to the Father that he was in the temple. That's what his response was. And so in the very first Passover pilgrimage, he was lost for 3 days because of the adherence to the Father's will. Now check out the beauty here. On the very last Passover pilgrimage to Jerusalem, Jesus is lost for 3 days because of adherence to the Father's will. The 3 days that we see here in Luke chapter 2 refer not only to Jesus as a 12-year-old, but almost pointed to his death, burial, and resurrection. Both Passover pilgrimages were difficult for Mary. When Jesus is 12 years old and he's lost in the temple, Mary exclaims that she was filled with anxiety. In fact, the scripture says great anxiety. And 21 years later, in his final Passover pilgrimage, Jesus will be betrayed, beaten, and crucified. And certainly those days were excruciating for Mary. Mary witnessed both of these quote-unquote 3 days first at hand. The 3 days when he was lost in the temple as a child, and the 3 days of his death, resurrection, when he was an adult. And as Mary frantically looked for her missing son when he was a child, she was filled with great anxiety. And we can only imagine if Simeon's words would echo in her heart then, from Luke chapter 2 verse 35, that you yourself a sword would pierce, that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed. Do you experience anxiety? And if so, when? And if so, why? And if so, what do you do with the anxiety? Far too often I paint an image in my imagination of what Mary and St. Joseph were like. And far too often the image that I had was anything but human. I imagined their lives more like Hollywood than Nazareth. However, the more time I spent with them, the more real their lives have become. And nowhere else do I know that I am not alone than when I experience anxiety. And nowhere else do you need to know that you're not alone than when you experience anxiety. The key with anxiety is not to isolate ourselves. A lot of us turn in when we're afraid. However, Mary and Joseph are with you. And the key is not to turn in, but to turn toward them. The real freedom in anxiety is not necessarily the lack of anxiety, but where do we turn with the anxiety? The beauty is that both Mary and Joseph know your hearts. And they know about anxiety firsthand because of what experience they had when Jesus was lost in the temple. Spend some time today with the Holy Family and ask them to show you how they handled anxiety. And ask them today, how is it that you handle anxiety? Ask them today, how is it that they want you to handle anxiety? Just for your prayer today, I would encourage you to maybe pray with Mary and Joseph, as again we've been praying in the hidden times, the hidden scenes in our imagination of Nazareth. And certainly they would have prayed a lot, obviously, as many people do, in the anxiety. Familiar with the Psalms, we can only imagine that they would have maybe even prayed with Psalm 4. And so I would encourage you to read Psalm 4. In fact, maybe even read it a few times. And again, just as you read it a few times, just pay attention to what word or phrase really tugs at your heart as you're praying with the psalm. And then maybe just like close your eyes, just kind of jump in the scene. Pray with chapter 2 of Luke, verses 44 and 45. Here's a scene. Jesus is missing. He's lost. He's gone. What went through Mary's heart? Like what was going through her as she realized that her son, her flesh and blood, is no longer with her? And as the Father picked to protect Jesus, what went through Joseph's heart as he searched for him? Be there, be with them, be in the scene. See their anxiety, feel their anxiety. And as you're in the scene, they actually turn to you and they ask you, what are you most anxious about? What's on your heart today? What do you want to tell them? Where do you need freedom in the midst of anxiety? God bless.